Well, welcome to another edition of Traveling Through History. Really glad you're here this evening. We're here to talk about one of the most consequential figures in world history, and that is William the Conqueror. Most people have heard of him, but most people don't know a lot about him and about what kind of impact he had on the world. And it was incredible, the reach he had, both in 1066 when he conquered England as a French nobleman and duke, but also all the individuals that he's impacted since. As a matter of fact, interesting fact, about 25% of England right now is related to William the Conqueror, even though he was a Frenchman conquering from abroad. And many, many millions of Americans are related to William the Conqueror, including myself. And actually, when my father did the research, we are related to William through 4 different lines in my family tree. So obviously, this has a lot of personal impact on me and a lot of reason that I was interested in William and wanted to do this research. So I'm really looking forward to bringing the history of William the Conqueror to you before 1066 and after 1066, the impact he had both on France and on England and really on the rest of the world, even after his death. We'll get into the history of William, his early years, the actual conquering crusade that he did to England in 1066, what he did to consolidate his power after 1066 all over England, and then what his lasting impact was on world history. We'll talk about all those things. In addition, we'll look at a couple short videos, and we'll come back afterwards and talk about those on the other side. And then, as always, that we do in this program, we look at the 25 interesting facts. So we'll look at those interesting facts about William. And I think you'll be very surprised about some of the things about his life. So let's go ahead and talk about William the Conqueror and look at his background. So William the Conqueror was born in Falaise, Normandy, France, in 1028. He died September 9th of 1087 in Rouen, France. He was a nobleman who made himself the mightiest in France and then changed the course of England's history through his conquest of that country in 1066. One of the greatest soldiers and rulers of the Middle Ages, he was Duke of Normandy from 1035 and King of England as William I from 1066 until his death. In his early years, he was the elder of 2 children of Robert I of Normandy. And his wife, Herleva, also Arlette, was the daughter of a tanner and undertaker from the town of Falaise. Sometime after William's birth, Herleva was married to Herluin, who was a Viscount of Conteville, by whom she bore 2 sons, including Otto, the future Bishop of Bayeux, and at least 1 daughter. In 1035, Robert died while returning from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and his only son, William, had been nominated as heir before his departure, was accepted as duke by the Norman magnates and by his overlord, King Henry I. One of the problems he had at the time, though, was he was only 8 years old. So he became William II of Normandy at that time, but ended up having handlers until he was 15. Once he was 15, he was able to take over fully as duke. William and his friends had to overcome enormous obstacles, including William's illegitimacy. He was generally known as William the Bastard, the fact that he had acceded as a child. His weakness led to a breakdown of authority throughout the Duchy. Private castles were erected, public power was usurped by lesser nobles, and private warfare broke out all over the countryside. 3 of William's guardians died violent deaths before he grew up, protecting him, and his tutor was even murdered. His father's kin were of little help, since most of them thought that they stood to gain by the boy's death. His mother, however, managed to protect him through most of this dangerous period. These early difficulties probably contributed to William's strength of purpose and his dislike of lawlessness and misrule throughout the countryside. In 1042, when William reached his 15th year, as we mentioned earlier, he was knighted and began to play a personal part in the affairs of his duchy. The worst was over. His attempts to recover rights lost during his anarchy, period, and to bring disobedient vassals and servants to heel inevitably led to trouble. From 1046 until 1055, he dealt with a series of baronial rebellions, mostly led by his kinsmen. So he actually had cousins and half-brothers that were all trying to get his duchy out from under him. Occasionally, he was in great danger and had to rely on Henry of France for help. But it was during these years that William learned to fight and to rule. A decisive moment came in 1047 when Henry and William defeated a coalition of Norman rebels at Valla-les-Dunes, which is southeast of Caen. It was a battle in which William first demonstrated his prowess as a warrior and as a leader. William soon learned to control his youthful recklessness. He was always ready to take calculated risks on campaign and fight a battle, but he was not a flamboyant commander. His plans were simple, his methods were very direct, and he ruthlessly exploited any opportunity he could. If he found himself at a disadvantage, he withdrew immediately. He showed the same qualities in his governmental style. He never lost sight of his aim to recover lost ducal rights and revenues. And although he developed no theory of government or great interest in administrative techniques, he was always prepared to improvise and to experiment. He was moral and pious by the standards of the time, and he acquired an interest in the welfare of the Norman church. He made his half-brother Odo Bishop of Bayeux in 1049 at the age of 16. And as bishop, Odo combined the roles of nobleman and prelate in a way that he did not greatly shock contemporaries. Although Odo and other bishops appointed by William were not recognized for their spirituality, they strengthened the church in Normandy by their pious donations and administrative skills. Presiding over numerous church councils, William and his bishops passed important legislation against simony, which is the selling of church offices, and clerical marriage. He also welcomed foreign monks and scholars to Normandy, including Lanfranc of Pavia, a famous master of the liberal arts who entered the monastery of Bec around 1042 and was made abbot of Caen in 1063. William endowed several monasteries in his duchy, significantly increasing their number, and introduced the latest currents in reform to Norman monasticism. According to a brief description by an anonymous author who borrowed extensively from Einhard's biography, Charlemagne, William was just above average height and had a robust, thick-set body with lots of muscle. Although he was always sparing of food and drink, he did become fat later in life after he was 40. He had a rough bass voice and was good and ready speaker. Writers of the next generation agree that he was exceptionally strong and vigorous. He was a hunter and a soldier. He was fierce and despotic and generally feared. He was uneducated, however. Some people think he was actually illiterate. He had grown up with few graces, but was intelligent and shrewd and had good street smarts. He soon obtained the respect of all of his rivals. After 1047, William began to participate in events outside his duchy in support of King Henry and in an attempt to strengthen his southern frontier and expand into the western county of Maine. He fought a series of campaigns against Geoffrey Martel, who was the Count of Anjou. But from 1052 on, when Henry and Geoffrey made peace and a serious rebellion against the eastern Normandy took place, William was again in grave danger. During this period, he conducted important negotiations with his cousin, Edward the Confessor, who was King of England at the time, in which he was named heir to the English throne and took a wife. And there is a lot of controversy about whether Edward really did make him the heir to the English throne, since Edward the Confessor was a very weak king. So that gives you a little bit of context. And also, he didn't have an heir. So he essentially had no kids other than a couple of daughters that he could hand the kingdom over to. And so, according to William, Confessor came over to meet him, Edward, and they discussed and negotiated a deal. So essentially, when Edward the Confessor died, William would be the heir and he would take over the throne. Norman interest in Anglo-Saxon England derived from an alliance made in 1002 when King Ethelred II of England married Emma, the sister of Count Richard II, who was William's grandfather. Two of her sons, William's cousins once removed, had reigned in turn in England. One was Harda Conte from 1040 to 1042, and the other one was Edward the Confessor, who we just mentioned, who ruled from 1042 to 1066. William had met Edward during the prince's exile on the continent and may well have given him some support when he returned to England in 1041. In that year, Edward was about 36, William was 13 years old. It was clear William expected some sort of reward from Edward. Thus, when Edward's marriage proved unfruitful, William began to develop an ambition to become his kinsman's heir. Edward, whose childlessness was a diplomatic asset, probably at times encouraged William's hopes. In 1049, William negotiated with Baldwin V of Flanders for the hand of his daughter Matilda. Baldwin, an imperial vassal with distinguished lineage, was in rebellion against the Emperor Henry III and was in desperate need of allies. At the Council of Realms in October 1049, the emperor's cousin, Pope Leo IX, condemned the proposed marriage as incestuous, but William and Baldwin were so eager for an alliance that the wedding took place before the end of 1053, and in 1059 William had reconciled to the papacy. And as a penance, he and Matilda built 2 monasteries at Caen. 4 sons were born to the couple: Robert, the future Duke of Normandy; Richard, who died young; William Rufus, his father's successor in England; and Henry, Rufus's successor. Among the daughters was Adela, who became mother of Stephen, the King of England, from 1135 to 1154. It is possible that William used his new alliance with Flanders to extort an acknowledgement from Edward that William was the English king's rightful heir. At all events, Edward seems to have made some sort of promise to William in 1051, the year in which Tostig, who was son of the greatest nobleman in England, Godwin, married Baldwin's half-sister. The immediate purpose of this triplet alliance was to improve the security of each of the parties. If William obtained a declaration that he was Edward's heir, he was also looking very far ahead. Between 1054 and 1060, William was threatened by the combined menace of an internal revolt in Normandy and the new alliance against him between King Henry and Geoffrey Martel. Had the Norman rebels coordinated their attacks with King and Count, it would have meant the end for William. But his own skill and some luck allowed him to prevail in this situation. After suppressing the rebels, William decisively defeated the invading forces of Henry and Geoffrey at the Battle of Mortimer in 1054. After a second victory at Varaville in 1057, the Duke was in firm control of all of Normandy. His position was secured even further when both Henry and Geoffrey died in 1060 and were succeeded by weaker rulers. Finally, conquering Maine in 1063, William had become the most powerful ruler in northern France by far. In 1064, Edward sent his brother-in-law Harold, Earl of Wessex, Godwin's son and Edward's eventual successor as king, on an embassy trip to Normandy to confirm Edward's recognition of William as the heir, according to Norman sources. While en route, Harold was captured by one of the Duke's vassals. He was ransomed by William, who then took him on a campaign into Brittany. It was at this time, according to Norman account, that Harold swore an oath in which he renewed Edward's bequest of the throne to William and promised to support it. This oath and Harold's violation of it would become the central elements of William's justification for his eventual invasion of England in 1066. When Edward died childless on January 5th of 1066, Harold was accepted as king by English magnates who did not want William. William decided at that time on war. He proceeded carefully, however, first taking steps to secure his duchy in Normandy and to obtain international support for his venture. He took counsel with his leading nobles, bestowed special authority on his wife Matilda and his son Robert, and appointed key supporters to important positions in the ducal administration. He petitioned the Pope in Rome and received the blessing of Alexander II, who was encouraged by Archdeacon Hildebrand to support the invasion. He also appealed to volunteers to join his army of invasion and won numerous recruits from outside of Normandy. Events outpaced William, however, as others moved more quickly. Tostig, Harold's exiled brother, raided England in May but suffered defeat at the hands of Harold's allies. By August, William had gathered his army and his fleet at the mouth of the Dives River. At this point, he probably intended to sail due north and invade England by way of the Isle of Wight and Southampton Water. But adverse winds held up his fleet, and in September, a westerly gale was at Saint-Valery on the Somme. He had suffered a costly delay, some naval losses, and a drop in morale of his troops. The delay, however, yielded a very important benefit for William. On September 8th, Harold was forced to release the peasant army he had summoned to defend the southern and eastern coastlines, leaving him without adequate protection. On September 27th, after cold and rainy weather, the wind turned in William's favor. William embarked his army and set sail for the southeastern coast of England. The trip was not without incident. William's ship lost touch with the rest of the fleet, but he calmed his crew by supping as if he were at home, and contacting with other ships was made not long after. The following morning he landed, took the unresisting towns of Pevensey and Hastings, and began to organize a bridgehead with 4,000 to 7,000 cavalry and infantry. William's forces were in a narrow coastal strip hemmed in by the great forest of Andred. And although this corridor was easily defensible, it was not much of a base for a conquest of England. The campaigning season was almost past, and when William received news of his opponent, it was not reassuring. On September 25th, Harold had defeated and slain Tostig and Harold at Stamford Bridge near York in a bloody battle with great losses on both sides, and he was retracing his steps to meet the new invader of Hastings. On October 13th, Harold emerged from the forest, but the hour was too late to push on to Hastings, and he took up a defensive position instead. Early the next day, before Harold had prepared his exhausted troops for battle, William attacked him. The English phalanx, however, held firm against William's archers and cavalry at first. The failure to break English lines caused disarray in the Norman army. As William's cavalry fled in confusion, Harold's soldiers abandoned their positions to pursue the enemy. William rallied the fleeing horsemen, however, and they turned and slaughtered the foot soldiers chasing them. On two subsequent occasions, William's horsemen feigned retreat, which fooled Harold's soldiers, who were then killed by their opponents. Harold's brothers were also killed early in the battle. Towards nightfall, the king himself fell, struck in the eye by an arrow, according to Norman accounts, and the English gave up and ran. William's coolness and tenacity secured him the victory in the fateful battle. He then moved quickly against possible centers of resistance to prevent a new leader from emerging. And on Christmas Day, 1066, he was crowned king in the Westminster Abbey in London. In a formal sense, the Norman conquest of England had just taken place, but in some ways it had just started. William was already an experienced ruler in Normandy. He had also replaced disloyal nobles and ducal servants with his friends while he was gone. The Norman church flourished under his reign as he adapted its structures to English traditions. Like many contemporary rulers, he wanted the church in England to be free of corruption, but also subordinate to him. Thus, he condemned simony and disapproved of clerical marriage. He would not tolerate opposition from bishops or abbots or interference from the papacy. But he remained on good terms with the popes Alexander II and Gregory VII, though tensions arose on occasion. During his reign, church synods were held much more frequently, and he also presided over several episcopal councils. He was ably supported in this by his close advisor Lanfranc, whom he made Archbishop of Canterbury, replacing Stignant. William replaced all other Anglo-Saxon bishops of England, except for Wulfstan of Dorchester, with his Norman colleagues. He also promoted monastic reform by importing Norman monks and abbots, thus quickening the pace of monastic life in England and bringing it into line with continental developments. William left England early in 1067, but had to return in December to deal with unrest back in England again. The rebellions had begun that year reaching their peak in 1069 when William resorted to such violent measures that even contemporaries were shocked. To secure his hold on the country, he introduced the Norman practice of building castles, including the Tower of London. The rebellions, which were crushed by 1071 completely, ended in the ruin of English higher aristocracy and secured its replacement by an aristocracy of Norman lords, who introduced a pattern of landholding and military service that had been developed in Normandy. To secure England's frontiers, he invaded Scotland in 1072 and Wales in 1081, creating special defensive marcher countries outside the Scottish and Welsh borders. During the last 15 years of his life, William was more often in Normandy than he was in England, although there were 5 years, possibly 7, in which he did not visit the kingdom at all. He retained most of the greatest Anglo-Norman barons with him in Normandy and confided the government of England to bishops, trusting especially his old friend Lanfranc, who ran things while he was out of England. He returned to England only when it was absolutely necessary. In 1075, to deal with the aftermath of a rebellion by Roger, Earl of Hereford, and Ralph, Earl of Norfolk, which was made more dangerous by the intervention of a Danish fleet, and 1082 to arrest and imprison his half-brother Odo, who was planning to take an army to Italy, perhaps to make himself pope. In the spring of 1082, William had his son Henry knighted in England, and in August at Salisbury he took oaths of fealty from all important landowners in England. In 1085 he returned with a large army to meet the threat of an invasion by Canute IV of Denmark. When this came to nothing, owing to Canute's death in 1086, William ordered an economic and territorial survey to be made of the kingdom. The results were summarized in 2 books of the Domesday Book, one of the greatest administrative accomplishments of the Middle Ages. During his duties as king, William remained preoccupied with the frontiers of Normandy, even after the conquest of England. The danger spots were in Maine and in Vixen on the Seine, where Normandy bordered the French royal Damas. After 1066, William's continental neighbors became more powerful, even more hostile. Fulk the Surly succeeded to Anjou in 1068, Robert the Frisian to Flanders in 1071, and King Philip I of France allied with Robert, and Robert allied with the Danish king Canute. There was also a problem of William's heir apparent, Robert Curthose, who, given no appanage, had seemingly kept short of money, left Normandy in 1077, and intrigued with his father's enemies. In 1081, William reached agreement with Fulk in the county of Blanchhead. Robert Curthose was to be Count of Maine, but only as a vassal of Fulk. The eastern part of the Vexin county of Mons had fallen completely into King Philip's hands in 1077 when William had been busy with Maine. In 1087, William demanded from Philip the return of towns Chaumont, Mons, and Pontoise. In July, he entered Montaze as a surprise, but while the town burned, he either suffered an injury from which he never recovered or he actually fell ill. Most sources differ, but most believe he actually fell off his horse and suffered an injury. He was thwarted at every moment when he seemed about to enforce his last outstanding territorial claim, both in England and in France. William was taken to the Priory of Saint-Gervais outside of Rouen, where he lay dying for 5 weeks after the fall off the horse. He had the assistance of some bishops and doctors, and in attendance were his half-brother Robert, Count of Mortain, and his younger sons William, Rufus, and Henry. Robert Curthose was with King of France. It had probably been William's intention that Robert, as was custom, should cede to the whole inheritance, although William was tempted to make loyal Rufus his sole heir. In the end, he compromised. Normandy and Maine went to Robert, and England went to Rufus. Henry was given great treasure with which to purchase an appanage. William died at daybreak on September 9th in his 60th year. He was buried at St. Stephen's Church, which he had built in Caen, France. And he had a very eventful life, as you can see. His funeral procession was actually disrupted by a fire in the town. Nobler complained that he had been dispossessed of the land in which William was to be buried, and William's body was broken as it has been forced into a stone coffin. Was broken as it was being forced into a stone coffin. The tomb itself was desecrated by Calvinists in the 16th century and by revolutionaries in the 18th century. In terms of his legacy, William left a profound mark on both Normandy and England, and is one of the most consequential and important figures of medieval English history. His personal resolve and good fortune allowed him to survive anarchy of Normandy in his youth, and he gradually transformed his duchy into the leading political and military power in all of France. His support for monastic reform and improved episcopal organization earned him respect from church leaders and further strengthened his hand in the duchy. His conquest of England in 1066 altered the course of English history, and even he adopted a number of Anglo-Saxon institutions and continued various social and economic trends that had begun before 1066. The English church was Normanized by William and brought more fully into line with the developments on the continent. William also imposed a new aristocracy on England that was French in language and culture. English language and literature and art and architecture were transformed because of William's conquest forever. The new king and his nobility were also very much involved with affairs in Normandy and France, and therefore the orientation of English royal policy shifted towards continental affairs. New forms of land tenure and military service were established after conquest. Castles dotted the landscape as a symbol of the new regime. As conqueror and king, William significantly shaped the history of England and all of Europe. William the Conqueror, a little bit about him, his background, his early years, how he consolidated power in Normandy and brought his duchy there into line. He ended up working directly with the King of France, and they were allies. He allied with a number of people, but he also had lots of enemies. And so he spent those first 35, 40 years or so really consolidating his power in France. And then took the opening that was left by Edward's death and vacuum. And also a promise of being King of England that he thought he had obtained from Edward through negotiation. And with that, because there was a new challenger in Harold, he decided to take the ships and the men across the channel and to go get what was rightfully his, which was the country of England. And so you can see he was an incredibly consequential figure in world history. We're still feeling the reverberations and the impacts of his conquest today. Old English would never be the same after William conquered with his noblemen, because 10,000 words from French were merged into the Old English language. So the language we speak today is a mix between Old English, French, and Latin. And William was right in the middle of all of that, and never would have happened except for his conquest of England in 1066. After 1066, you see he continued to spend his time trying to subdue and conquer the rest of England and the outlying areas like Ireland and Wales and Scotland, and continue to put down rebellions all over the English landscape. And then, of course, he also would sail back and forth. He would go back to Normandy for a couple of years and make sure that his duchy there was solid as well. And so he spent a lot of time going back and forth, also appointing people on both sides of the English Channel that were loyal to him and make sure that they would be part of the realm. So really an incredible history. The fact that I'm related to him and so many millions of others are, the fact that he impacted our culture and our language and everything else to do with England and France, and also, of course, the United States, because so many of us are descended from him, makes him just an incredible and fascinating character in our history. So let's go ahead and take a look at a series of videos, and we'll come back and talk about it on the other side.
Today, on Brief History, we look at one of the most well-known, respected, feared, and loathed English monarchs remembered in history. Embattled and contested throughout his entire kingship and dukedom, this man would adapt, overcome, conquer, and slaughter to reserve a space in history that few could parallel. Join me as I take a brief look at William I of England, or as you may know him, the Conqueror. William was born sometime around 1027 at Chateau de Falaise in Normandy, France. He was the son of Robert I, Duke of Normandy, who was known as the Magnificent. At the time of Robert's succession, tensions ran high amidst the nobles in Normandy due to assertions that Robert had killed his older brother Richard for control of the duchy. However, by 1031, Robert had gained support from a majority of nobles to garner a certain degree of peace in the area. It is said that Robert had many mistresses, one of which was a woman named Erleva. She was the daughter of Fulbert of Falaise, which historians have concluded was a local tanner. Erleva carried on an affair with Robert and soon gave birth to William out of wedlock. At that time, he was referred to as William the Bastard due to his illegitimate birth, a far less appealing nickname than his future title. Erleva would later go on to marry Erloin de Conteville, with which she had two sons, William's half-brothers Odo and Robert. In 1034, William's father Robert decided on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem with the intent to return in time, but died in the Greek city of Nicaea, modern-day Iznik, Turkey, on his return trip to Normandy. However, before Robert departed on his journey, he had his supporters swear fealty to William as the successor to the duchy. With Robert's untimely death, William was forced into a nefarious situation, as he was only approximately 8 years old when he became the Duke of Normandy. This made him a target for power grabs, with nobles wanting control of the young duke and the duchy. He did, however, have strong allies. His great-uncle Robert was the Archbishop of Rouen and a staunch ally, along with King Henry I of France, who, although was a fervent ally of William's in his youth, will go on to oppose him once William's power becomes apparent. Unfortunately, his great-uncle died in 1037, and with him died one of William's main supporters. Quickly, the battle for control of the young duke ensued. Over the course of time, William had multiple regents and guardians, many of which died mysteriously or were outright killed due to their position. One of which was allegedly killed in William's bedchamber as William slept through the night. Although the barons fought for control, they still acknowledged William as the heir to the dukedom, and he continued to have support from King Henry I of France. However, anti-William sentiment began to arise, and in 1046, a rebellion was formed, led by William's cousin and childhood friend, Guy of Burgundy. William initially escaped and sought refuge with King Henry I, but returned to Normandy in 1047 to defeat the rebellion with the assistance of Henry. Guy and the rebels were defeated at the Battle of Valais-Dun near Caen, after which he retreated to his castle at Brion, which was besieged by William. Guy was eventually exiled in 1050, and William and King Henry would then turn their attention to Geoffrey Martel, the Count of Anjou, as Geoffrey had attempted to seize control of the County of Maine after the death of Hugh IV of Maine. Instead, in a twist of power, William would be the one to seize the majority of control over the County of Maine after he and Henry were able to drive Geoffrey out of the county. Unfortunately, many thought this gave William exceedingly too much power, including many of William's nobles. It was at this time that many of his nobles turned on him within his duchy. This was also the time that King Henry became weary of William's power and decided to partner with his previous adversary, Geoffrey of Anjou, to contest William's growing power. They, along with the Norman rebels, led a double invasion of Normandy in an attempt to rein in William's ever-growing power. The invasions were beaten back by William and his supporters after they defeated one of the invasion forces at the Battle of Mortimer in 1054, further cementing William's growing power in the region. Although Henry and Geoffrey continued to contest William's power for the next 6 years through a series of separate invasions and sieges, their deaths, both in 1060, reinforced the shift in the balance of power to William, who is now a battle-hardened warrior and power-hungry duke. By the time William had consolidated his power in 1060, following the deaths of Geoffrey and Henry, he had been married to his wife Matilda of Flanders for approximately 10 years, as they had married in the early 1050s. Matilda was the daughter of Baldwin V, the incredibly powerful Count of Flanders, This alliance would become crucial as Baldwin would become the co-regent to the 7-year-old heir to Henry's throne, Philip I. After securing his western border with Brittany via an invasion and gaining remaining control of the county of Maine via his son Robert's marriage to Margaret of Maine, he turned his attention across the channel to the English throne with the understanding that the young king would not continue Henry's campaign against him due to Baldwin's influence. The English king at the time was Edward the Confessor, who was childless and in old age. William was familiar with Edward due to the fact that his father Robert supported Edward during his exile when Viking claimants held the throne in England. Edward spent much of his exile in Normandy, and it was alleged that Edward designated William to be the successor to the English throne. This is plausible due to the fact that William was the grandson of Edward's maternal uncle, Richard II of Normandy. However, upon Edward's ascension to the throne and subsequent death, things would not pan out as William had expected. One of the most powerful barons in England at the time was Godwin, Earl of Wessex, who gained his power under Danish King Canute the Great. Godwin became a supporter of Edward the Confessor's claim to the throne, culminating in Edward marrying Godwin's daughter, Edith, in 1043. However, the relationship between Edward and Godwin turned in 1051, and Godwin was exiled by Edward. This was mainly orchestrated by the conniving Robert of Jumièges, the Archbishop of Canterbury. It was at this time that Edward allegedly offered the throne to William. Godwin gained support and forcefully returned from exile in 1052, reaching an agreement with King Edward to have his lands and titles reinstated. However, Robert of Jumièges fled the country and took one of Godwin's sons and nephews as hostages to hand over to William, who he sought refuge with. Godwin died in 1053, and his son Harold succeeded him as the Earl of Wessex. Godwin also had other sons that gained earldoms between 1053 and 1057, including his son Tostig, who became the Earl of Northumbria in 1055, and would play a crucial role in William's ascension to the English throne. Harold's power in England continued to grow, with Harold's victory over Welsh raiders in the west of the country. Harold decided to make a diplomatic trip to Normandy to try and secure his prisoner brother and cousin from William, but the trip soon turned into a disaster. He was blown off course by unfavorable winds and was shipwrecked off the coast of Normandy. William's nobles captured Harold, and he was brought before William. William kept him as a quasi-royal guest and quasi-prisoner. It is believed that Harold was not aware of Edward's offer to William to be the heir at the time of his trip. It is said that Harold went with William on his campaign in Brittany, and that William made Harold swear to honor his bid to become the King of England over holy relics in order for Harold to be granted passage back to England. Harold did so, but under duress, and had no intention of keeping his oath. When the ailing King Edward was on his deathbed, he nominated Harold to be his successor to the throne in January 1066. At that time, the English throne was not inherited, but instead the king was elected by a group of noblemen known as the Witan. Upon his nomination as heir and subsequent election, Harold was crowned king in Westminster Abbey a short time later. William was furious when word of Harold's coronation reached him. In William's mind, there was no doubt. This was a usurpation, and William would begin preparations to take the throne from Harold by force. However, Harold was a battle-hardened warrior and a powerful leader who knew all too well that William would be crossing the channel to contest his kingship. He knew he had the upper hand, as William would have to land his men before a battle could take place. With that in mind, he started preparations to gain support to defend his position and set the stage for a battle whose reverberations would be felt for hundreds of years. In 1065, the nobles of Northumbria rebelled against Harold's brother Tostig in favor of Morcar, who was the younger brother of the Earl of Mercia, Edwin. Due to the fact that Harold was aware that he needed the support of Edwin and Morcar in his bid for the throne, he sided with the rebels, convincing King Edward to replace his brother with Morcar. Tostig escaped to Flanders with his wife Judith, who was the half-sister of Baldwin V of Flanders. However, Tostig would not go away quietly. He attempted an invasion with the assistance of Baldwin, having intentions of regaining the lands and titles taken from him. However, he was not able to muster much support, and he retreated to the north of the country. Meanwhile, William was amassing his army and building his fleet at the river Dives to sail across the channel and confront Harold. He also obtained a papal banner and consent from Pope Alexander II for the invasion based on Harold's oath over the holy relics, and was said to have even carried the relics into battle. By August, William's army was ready to sail. However, unfavorable winds kept him in Normandy until September, with some of his ships being driven up the channel. He regrouped his fleet at Saint-Valery on the Somme. This delay was costly, but proved beneficial to him in the end. Tausig had contacted Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, and helped convince him to pursue his claim to the English throne. Hardrada was the heir of King Magnus I, who made a pact with Harthacnut in 1040, who held the English throne during Edward's exile. The pact stated that if either Magnus or Harthacnut died without an heir, the other would inherit the kingdom of the deceased. With Tausig by his side, he raised an army and sailed to Northumbria in September 1066. They were able to defeat Tausig's replacement, Morcar, and his brother Edwin at the Battle of Fulford near York. With this news, Harold marched his army north to meet his traitorous brother and the Viking invader. He encountered them at Stamford Bridge on September 25, 1066. Tausig and Hardrada were defeated, both being killed in battle, but Harold took heavy casualties. A couple days later, the winds would finally be in William's favor, and he, with his army, would sail to England, landing at Pevensey Bay on September 28, 1066. William moved to the east, near the town of Hastings, where he began to set up his base of operations. Harold began to march his battle-weary troops back south, and word of William's landing reached him during his return trip. By October 13th, he had reached the edge of the forest near Hastings and camped approximately 13 kilometers, 8 miles from where William's base was in Hastings. The next day, October 14th, the battle commenced at 9 a.m. Harold attempted to surprise William, but William's scouts notified him of the approaching Anglo-Saxon army. It is believed that Harold set up a defensive position between Caldbeck Hill and Talham Hill, often referred to as Senlac Hill, near the modern-day town of Battle in East Sussex. William's archers opened the battle with little effect, with William subsequently sending his spearmen forward, who were also not able to break the English line. William then sent his cavalry into action, which also failed to have the effect William desired. His left flank, which was manned by volunteers from Brittany acquired during the previous campaign against Brittany, broke and began to retreat. At this time, word began to flow through William's ranks that he had been killed, adding to the retreat. Some of the English army began to pursue the fleeing Normans, thinking a rout was at hand. It was at this time that William famously tore off his helmet and rode through his troops, showing his face and rallying them to turn and re-engage the enemy. The smaller group of pursuing English forces were engaged and quickly obliterated. It is said that William had his men feign retreat at least twice in the battle, a tactic which had been used by the Normans before. This had the desired effect of causing English warriors to pursue, only to be counterattacked and destroyed. Eventually, the battle began to sway in William's favor. Harold, having already lost 2 of his brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, in battle, was allegedly killed with an arrow to the eye, thus leaving the English forces without their leader. Without their king, many soldiers gave up and decided to flee, with pursuit being given by the Normans, thus ending the Battle of Hastings. After the battle concluded, the victorious William showed a small glimpse of the savagery he would impose on the English throughout his kingship. It was said that Harold's mother offered her son's weight in gold for the return of the body, but William refused. Instead, Harold's body was mutilated, with his head and one leg cut off, along with the majority of the other. It is widely accepted that he was buried in Bosham Church, near the coast, with which he had strong ties to. Much of the remaining English battlefield dead were stripped naked and left on the battlefield. It was expected that the English aristocracy would capitulate to William after his defeat of Harold at Hastings. Instead, the Witan attempted to elect Edgar Atheling, the teenage boy and grandson of English King Edmund Ironside, who was the king deposed by the Viking claimants prior to Edward the Confessor's kingship. Edgar was nominated, but never crowned. William slowly made his way to London, capturing the royal treasury at Winchester along the way. He arrived at London in December, at which point Edgar Atheling and the Witens submitted to William. He was crowned at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. Although William had defeated Harold's army and ultimately commanded control of the nobles, he knew that a small group of non-English-speaking Normans could not run the country efficiently on their own. Many English nobles retained their lands and titles. He did, however, replace a large majority of them with Norman aristocrats, which included his half-brother Odo, who was the Bishop of Bayeux, and William Fitz-Osbern, who was the son of one of William's guardians who had been killed protecting William in his childhood. In the same vein, church positions were almost exclusively Norman, and religion throughout the country was heavily Normanized. He left Odo and Fitz-Osbern in charge of the country for a short time as he returned to Normandy. Eventually, discontent began to grow, and rebellions seemed to continuously arise, which included prominent figures such as Edgar Atheling, Morcar, and Edwin. William took on a system of castle building to maintain a hold on the area, and to keep a physical reminder in the eyes of the population of who was truly in charge of the country. Many of these castles still exist in the modern day, including the White Tower, which would eventually become the Inner Hall of the Tower of London. At this time, the northern part of the country would become a problem for William. The broad term of English is not quite accurate in describing the population, as the different parts of the country were very different culturally. Much of the north was settled by and held loyalty towards Scandinavia, as opposed to the Saxons settled south. The southern Anglo-Saxon kings historically exerted little control over the Anglo-Scandinavian north during their reigns. However, William had no intention of continuing this tradition, and anger began to fester within William with regards to the north. Much of the resistance was based around Edgar Atheling, who had submitted to William before his coronation in December. Edgar's supporters killed northern earls loyal to William and replaced them with rebels. Edgar also contacted Sweyn II of Denmark for assistance. Sweyn sailed with the fleet to the north of England, and he and Edgar raided the coast and took the city of York. At that point, William decided to personally intervene, and his rage toward the area would lead to one of the cruelest occurrences attributed to William during his reign in England. After William reached York in the winter of 1069, Edgar's army had fled, with Edgar seeking sanctuary with his sister in Scotland, who was married to King Malcolm III. The Danish army camped near their ships for the winter. William negotiated with them and paid them off to return to Denmark without a fight, which they did. He then turned his attention to the English rebels. Due to the fact that the rebels were not willing to stand and fight him in battle, he turned to a policy of destruction and scorched earth in a sequence of events known today as the Harrying of the North. Many innocent people were slain, and all crops, livestock, food reserves, and tools were destroyed. His army destroyed settlements and massacred populations. Since all food reserves were destroyed along with any other means of sustenance, famine was widespread, with some survivors turning to cannibalism. It is estimated that 75% of the population was killed, died of starvation, or left the area never to return. It was said that on William's deathbed, he expressed repentance for the suffering he had caused in the north during this time. Rebellions continued both in England and Normandy. Sweyn of Denmark returned and was defeated in 1070. Edwin and Morcar were defeated, with Edwin being killed and Morcar imprisoned. Malcolm III of Scotland invaded the north of the country and was defeated and forced to remove Edgar Atheling from his court in 1072. Deaths on the continent led him to lose allies in Flanders and France, and revolts arose in Maine, Anjou, and Brittany. Three powerful earls in England, led the revolt of the Earls, which was mostly defeated by William's allies. He also started to have issues within his family structure. His son Robert grew angry due to his lack of power bestowed upon him and rebelled with the assistance of Philip I of France and other leaders who opposed William. William was actually defeated at Geberrois, where he was besieging Robert. It was during this battle that he was famously unhorsed by Robert, but was not killed. Robert and William would eventually reconcile for a short time, and Robert assisted William in putting down a Scottish raid in the north in 1080. William then arrested and imprisoned his half-brother Odo due to his desire to invade southern Italy without William's consent, and his wife Matilda of Flanders, with whom he was very close to, died in 1083. Robert again rebelled with the assistance of the French king around the same time, and although he remained as king and duke, the weight of the crown was substantial. Around the end of 1086, William returned to Normandy. Robert was still in rebellion, and William led a campaign against him. During this time, he was said to have been injured by the pommel of his saddle and fell ill. On his deathbed, he did his best to reconcile and sort out his affairs. He gave gifts to the church and the poor. He had his brother Odo released from prison, and he designated his son Robert as the heir to the Norman Duchy. His second surviving and favorite son, William Rufus, he willed to become the King of England, with his third surviving son, Henry, receiving monetary compensation. On September 9th, 1087, William died in the priory of Saint-Gervais in Rouen. It is said that all in attendance abandoned the body where it laid, and his body was stripped of all possessions. Eventually he was moved to Caen, where he had requested to be laid to rest. Neither Robert nor William Rufus attended the funeral. Only his youngest son, Henry, attended. It is said that the ceremony was interrupted by a local citizen who claimed that William had stolen his land for the construction of the church without compensation. This was determined to be true, and the man was compensated for his lost land. Continuing with the already odd ceremony, William's bloated body did not fit into the tomb. As the bearers attempted to force the body into the tomb, it burst, releasing a foul odor throughout the church, causing those in attendance to draw back. This would, however, not end up being the final indignity for William. His grave was desecrated many times over the centuries during the French Wars of Religion and French Revolution, with all of his bones being destroyed or lost. Currently, his memorial exists in the Abbaye aux Hommes in Caen, where he was initially buried. William's life left an astounding impact on the world. Whether you view him as a foreign invader or the rightful heir to the kingship, his life sent ripples throughout time, influencing people's day-to-day lives up to current day. A perfect example of this is the English language itself. With the sudden and absolute takeover of the country by foreign French-speaking conquerors and subsequent domination of the church and nobles, the English language morphed throughout history, being strongly influenced by French after conquest. There are, incredibly, also physical relics that still exist from his time as king, including the Bayeux tapestry, which is actually an embroidered cloth made in England, but was commissioned a couple years after William's victory at Hastings, and shows the events leading up to and including the Battle of Hastings. The Domesday Book, which was commissioned by William near the end of his life to account for all the land holdings in his possession and the assets and people they contained. And lastly, his castles, which still dot the English countryside, a concrete reminder of his power and legacy. We know that his life is not without criticism. His brutal mistreatment of the North and warlord mentality have led some to believe William to be less a king and more a genocidal, power-hungry monster. But he was a product of his situation and times, walking a dangerous line for the entirety of his life. Many a time could he have made a wrong decision that cost him his life, but with wit, military cunning, political talent, and luck, he remained at the pinnacle until his final breath. And for this, he will forever be remembered not just as a king, but as a conqueror.
So you can see there are just so many amazing things coming out of that video. The first one being the fact that he was able to survive from 8 years old on, after his father died on his way back from his pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The only reason he was able to survive as a young boy, even though he was heir to the Duchy, is because he had so many great allies around him, people that believed in him, including the King of France, but also many others that were powerful that were protecting him. And you saw that many of them ended up dying over the years protecting him. Quite a few would die in very mysterious ways. The fact that he was able to survive with the help of his mother and the help of his uncle and the rest of his family is really kind of a miracle. When he finally got to 15 years old, as you can see, he was starting to get his wits about him. He was starting to consolidate some of his power. He was learning to actually operate on the battlefield and learn leadership skills. And after that, he spent many, many years consolidating power in all of Normandy and in Maine and in some of the territories around Normandy. So he spent that time essentially from 15 years old till he was 40, about 25 years of consolidating his power in France and becoming the true Duke of Normandy and one of the most powerful individuals in all of Europe. The King of France himself was an ally of his, but later on would turn against him along with some others because they feared him so much and they were really worried about how much power William had been obtaining. They especially opposed him when he then invaded in 1066 and took over England and became the King of England, a throne which he actually thought he was rightfully due because of Edward the Confessor and the promise that he had made him when they had met in Normandy and when he and his family had protected Edward at other times of his life. So you can see unbelievable consequential life, the impact that he had on Europe back then and the impact he still has today with language and with culture and with all the monuments and castles and churches that he built all over Normandy, all over England. And obviously, as we mentioned before, so many English and Americans are actually related to him, including myself. So the impact he's had is just immeasurable. It's very hard to understand how important his life was in our history. Other things from that video that were interesting, you notice how beautiful Normandy is and how beautiful the castles in Normandy are. And the same with England. Some of the amazing structures he left behind, not just the Tower of London, but hundreds and hundreds of castles all over England, which were essentially showing his power as King of England, really left his memorable mark on English history. And then as you saw towards the end of his life there, he probably would have just continued on, but he did have this unfortunate accident in a battle in 1087 when he was fallen off of his horse. Apparently very violently was rammed into the pommel of his horse. And then 5 weeks later died of illnesses due to that particular fall. And who knows what would have happened if he had stayed on and continued to consolidate his power. And you can see afterwards what happened with his leaving of his affairs, essentially splitting up all of his many conquerings to his three sons. One of them he had bequeathed Normandy, made him the Duke of Normandy. The other son he made the King of England. And then the other son he gave a fairly vast fortune to. And of course, even today, King Charles and Prince William and Queen Elizabeth and all of them are all directly related to William. So his descendants are still on the throne in England, which is really a pretty amazing fact. So hopefully you enjoyed that, learned a lot from that video. Now we're going to talk about the 25 interesting facts of William the Conqueror. Number one, William's illegitimacy affected his entire life. William was the illegitimate son of Robert I, Duke of Normandy, and Herleva, a tanner's daughter. Despite his illegitimacy, William was recognized as his father's heir and became Duke of Normandy at the age of 8 and started his actual rule at 15 years old. His early years were marked by constant threats to his life and position, leading to a tough and resilient character. William's nickname, William the Bastard, was commonly used during his youth due to his illegitimate birth, and he wasn't called William the Conqueror until the Norman conquest of England. He received military training from a young age, which helped him become a skilled and strategic leader. You can see a really great artist portrait there of William the Conqueror in front of one of his castles that he built. and a artist rendering of what he looked like as a boy when he took over at 8 years old. Number 2, William's rise to power as King of England was filled with many challenges to his claim of power, and you saw a little bit of that in the video. William's journey to become the King of England was filled with battles, alliances, challenges, and strategic moves. In 1047, William faced a rebellion from Norman nobles, but successfully crushed it at the Battle of Val de Dunes. He strengthened his position by marrying Matilda of Flanders in 1053 and forming a powerful alliance with Flanders. And of course, Flanders today is Belgium. So that's what they called Belgium back then. William's claim to the English throne was based on a promise allegedly made by his cousin, Edward the Confessor. In 1066, William assembled a fleet of hundreds of boats and an army to invade England, leading to the famous Battle of Hastings, which you saw some clips there in the video about the Battle of Hastings. On October 14th, 1066, William defeated King Harold II at the Battle of Hastings, changing the course of English history. You see a great picture there, artist rendering of what the Battle of Hastings must have looked like that day. It went on, like we talked about earlier, started at 9 a.m. and went all day long till about 10 p.m. at night. I can't imagine what the carnage looked like that day. And then you see a artist rendering there on the left of the Battle of Valdunes, where William had to put down the rebellion against Norman nobles. Number 3, William's reign brought significant changes to England, both politically and culturally. William was crowned King of England on Christmas Day in 1066 at Westminster Abbey. He introduced the feudal system to England, redistributing land to his noble followers. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William in 1085, was a comprehensive survey of England's lands and resources. William built numerous castles across England, including iconic Tower of London, to establish control over the people. His reign saw the replacement of the Anglo-Saxon elite with noble individuals from Norman culture, altering the social structure. The courts and official government agencies in England switched to French as the official language because William and his group did not know Old English. Modern English is a mix of Old English and French words because this brought major cultural change that William brought to the country. I'd also mention that English today also is a mix of Latin as well. You can see a picture there on the top left of some of William's men out actually doing the surveying in English countryside and building the notes that led to the Domesday Book, which you see a copy of it there on the bottom left. Number 4, William the Conqueror's military prowess extended beyond the Battle of Hastings, showcasing his strategic genius. In 1072, William invaded Scotland, forcing King Malcolm III to submit and recognize him as the overlord. He successfully quashed several rebellions in England, including the harrying of the North in 1069 to 1070. And you saw in the video a little bit about that, how brutal his tactics were to subdue the North, and that he actually repented about that on his deathbed. William's military campaigns extended to Maine and to Brittany, consolidating his power in France as well. His ability to adapt and innovate in warfare made him a formidable opponent on the battlefield. William's use of cavalry and archers at the Battle of Hastings was revolutionary for its time, and he used his technique throughout his military career, with many commanders imitating his strategies. You see a picture there on the bottom left of one of the bridges that was attacked during the Scotland battle, and you can see some of the tactics he was famous for, using archers and using cavalry. One of the main reasons he was successful at Hastings against Harold was that he used archers and he used cavalry in a very effective way. And Harold didn't have that same to counter. So eventually he would just wear down his opponents with these different tactics. Number 5, William's personality and traits played a crucial role in his success as ruler. Known for his immense physical strength, William was said to have powerful build and commanding presence. When he walked into the room, everyone stopped to hear what he had to say and hung on every word. He was a devout Christian, often seeking the counsel of the church and supporting monastic reforms. Despite his harsh methods, William was known to be fair and just ruler when he was not in battle, and he earned the loyalty of his followers. His determination and ambition were evident in his relentless pursuit of power and control. William's ability to inspire and lead his troops was a key factor in his military successes, and he would always lead from the front. You can see a picture there on the bottom left of him leading from the front in one of his many battles. The men very much respected the fact that he wouldn't stay back behind, but he would actually lead out front and rally the troops. You see another picture there on the bottom right of him during his crowning day on Christmas Day, 1066. Number 6, William the Conqueror's legacy continues to influence England and beyond, centuries after his death. The Norman conquest led to the blending of the Anglo-Saxon and Norman cultures, shaping modern English society. William's reign marked the beginning of the Norman dynasty in England, which lasted until about 1154. His introduction of the feudal system laid the foundation for medieval English governance and land ownership. The Domesday Book remains a valuable historical document, providing insights into 11th century England. William's impact on architecture, law, and governance can still be seen in England today. William's descendants are still on the throne today in England, and William, as first prince, will become king when Charles passes away, and he's one of many successors named after the Conqueror. So it will really be interesting when William takes over as King of England, because then the full circle will come back around from William the Conqueror, one of his ancestors. Number 7, William the Conqueror was of Viking descent. Though he spoke a dialect of French and grew up in Normandy, a fiefdom loyal to the French kingdom, William and other Normans descended from Scandinavian invaders of northern France. William's great-great-great-grandfather, Rollo, and you see a picture of him there in the blue, pillaged northern France with fellow Viking raiders in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, eventually accepting his own territory from the King of France, Normandy named for the Norsemen who controlled it. And he accepted this land from the King of France in exchange for peace. And again, you see that great picture there of Rollo, his great-great-great-grandfather, and then also a statue to Rollo that's actually in Normandy today. Number 8, William had reason to hate his original name, the Bastard. The product of an affair between Robert I, Duke of Normandy, and a woman named Herleva, William was known to his contemporaries as William the Bastard for much of his life. His critics continue to use this moniker after he defeated the English at the Battle of Hastings, and he earned an upgrade to William the Conqueror. He hated the name Bastard and was eager to get rid of it later in life. He despised even more any disrespect for his mother, who was an unmarried mistress to his father and was the daughter of a tanner. His critics would say William has the smell of a tanner, of which he took great offense. And you can see a picture there on top left of William and an artist's rendering of him. And then there's actually a statue of Herleva, who was his mother. That's actually in France today. He was very protective of her. Number 9, William's future bride wanted nothing to do with him at first. When William asked for the hand of Matilda of Flanders, a granddaughter of France's King Robert II, she refused, perhaps because of his illegitimacy or her entanglement to another man at the time. According to legend, the snubbed Duke tackled Matilda in the street, pulling her off her horse by her long braids. In any event, she consented to marry him and bore him 10 children before her death in 1083, which plunged William into a deep depression, and his aide said he was never the same after that. You see a great picture there of Matilda of Flanders on the left, and also a statue of her in the middle, and then a picture of William and his wife, Matilda of Flanders. And it really was a love affair. Number 10, he made England speak franglais. William spoke no English when he ascended to the throne of England, and he failed to master it despite his efforts, including a language tutor. Thanks to the Norman invasion, French was spoken in English courts for centuries and completely transformed the English language, infusing it with as many as 10,000 new words from French and Latin. Old English slowly died out over the centuries, replaced by William's new combination language, with some described as franglais. You see another picture there of William and also one of the many castles, hundreds of them, that he created all over England to display his power. Number 11, William had to spend years subduing his new kingdom all over England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. William may have hoped the English would surrender following his victory at Hastings, but they did nothing of the sort. Instead, some of the English clergy and magnates nominated Edgar the Etheling as king, though their support for Edgar was only lukewarm. After waiting a short while, William secured Dover, parts of Kent, and Canterbury, while also sending a force to capture Winchester, where the royal treasury was. These captures secured William's rear areas and his line of retreat to Normandy. William then marched to Southwark across the Thames from London, which he reached in late November. Next, he led his forces around the south and west of London, burning along the way. He finally crossed the Thames at Wallingford in early December. William then sent forces into London to construct a castle. He was crowned at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day 1066. You see a picture there at the Battle of Hastings, an artist rendering there on the bottom left. And then you can see some of the many battles he had the first year he was king to try to subdue all of England. Wellaford, Battle of Fulford, Stamford Bridge, Berkhamsted, London, Southwark, Hastings, and Pevensey. So this was a very large undertaking. Hastings was not the end of it, but was actually the beginning of it to consolidate his power. Number 12, Harold tried to surprise William at the Battle of Hastings in 1066. Harold spent about a week on his march from South London, averaging about 27 miles per day for the distance of approximately 200 miles to Hastings. Although Harold attempted to surprise the Normans, William's scouts reported the English arrival to the Duke. William led his army from the castle and advanced towards the enemy upon their arrival. Harold had taken a defensive position at the top of Senlac Hill, about 6 miles from William's castle at Hastings. The battle began about 9 a.m. on October 14, 1066, and it lasted all day. William had both cavalry and infantry, including many archers, while Harold only had foot soldiers and a few, if any, archers. The English soldiers formed up as a shield wall along the ridge were at first so effective that William's army was thrown back with heavy casualties. Some of William's Breton troops panicked and fled, and some of the English troops appear to have pursued the fleeing Bretons until they themselves were attacked and destroyed by Norman cavalry. During the Bretons' flight, rumors swept through the Norman forces that William had been killed, but William succeeded in rallying his troops by flipping his helmet up to show his face. And you can see a great artist rendering there on the top left. That's actually on the Bayeux Tapestry. It's a very famous tapestry we'll talk about a little bit later, but you can see him flipping up his helmet to show his face to his troops to rally them and to attack the enemy. It appears that the Norman advantage with the archers and cavalry was the difference in the end, and the decisive event of the day was Harold's death. The Bayeux Tapestry has been claimed to show Harold's death by an arrow to the eye. And you saw a little bit about that in the video, that he was struck in the eye by an arrow, according to legend. Number 13, William's court jester Taillefer was the first casualty of the Battle of Hastings. And you see a picture of Taillefer there on the top right on a horse, and then also on the bottom right when he was in costume for his entertainment. William's jester rode beside him during the invasion of England, lifting the troops' spirits by singing about heroic deeds of the Normans. Having a jester or a fool with a king at all times was very common in medieval times to entertain the court. When they reached enemy lines, he taunted the English by juggling his sword and was promptly killed, and therefore became the first casualty of the day. This initiated the historic battle, and William would later say he wanted to avenge every Norman killed that day. So pretty interesting that his court jester was actually the first casualty. Number 14, William's body exploded at his funeral, and you saw a little bit about this in the video. William died after his horse reared up during a 1087 battle, throwing the king against his saddle pommel so forcefully that his intestines ruptured. An infection set in that killed him several weeks later. William later in life had become a very large man, being overweight according to standards of the time. As priests tried to stuff William into a stone coffin that proved too small for his bulk, they pushed on his abdomen, causing it to burst out into the open. Mourners supposedly ran for the door to escape the putrid stench. So you can imagine how horrible a scene this was. They were trying to bury this incredibly consequential king, and of course it did not go very well. Number 15, he is an ancestor of millions of people. We mentioned this in the early part of the program. Every English monarch who followed William, including Queen Elizabeth II, Charles, and William, who's today's prince, is considered a descendant of the Norman-born king. According to some genealogists, more than 25% of the English population is also related to him, as are countless Americans with British ancestry, and of course that includes myself and my family. William, an Old French name composed of Germanic elements, will meaning desire and helm meaning protection, was introduced to England by William the Conqueror and quickly became widespread. The most popular names before 1066 were Henry and Edward, but after Battle of Hastings, William became the most popular boy name by far in England. Today, William ranks in the top 10 names in England, and some believe the future crowning of another King William will propel the name even higher. You see a picture there of William on the top, and then the current William, who's the prince in line to the kingdom. Number 16, William's father, Robert, was Duke of Normandy and died on his return from Jerusalem, and we heard this in the video about this trip that he took and that he died on the way home. In 1034, Duke Robert decided to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and as we mentioned earlier, this family were Christians and very devout. Although some of his supporters tried to dissuade him, he convened a council on January 1035 and had the assembled Norman magnates swear fealty to William as the heir before leaving for Jerusalem. He died in early July at Nicaea on his way back to Normandy. William faced several challenges on becoming duke, including his illegitimate birth and his youth. He was either 7 or 8 years old when he ascended to duke. He enjoyed the support of his great-uncle Archbishop Robert as well as King Henry I of France, which enabled him to succeed his father. And you can see this very complicated family tree that William the Conqueror had, going up to Robert and Herleva, and then all the many other people that were in his tree. And so this caused him a lot of issues because a lot of these folks were dukes and other very important people and would very much seek the power that he was ascending to. And so he had to deal with all of these people in one way or another throughout his life to consolidate his power. Number 17, William ordered the commissioning of the Domesday Book so he could find out what everybody owned in England. You see a picture there on the bottom of the big Domesday Book volume and the small Domesday Book volume. There's a big and a small. In 1085, King William was holding a meeting with his officials and bishops. According to the words of Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the king had a great thought and very deep conversation with his council about this land, how it was occupied, and with which men. Then he sent his men all over England into each shire, commissioning them to find out how many hundreds of hides were in the shire, meaning how many animals, what land the king himself had, and what livestock upon the land, or what taxes he ought to have by the year from each shire. So he wanted to know how many animals were on each piece of land, whether the land was owned by an individual or by himself, and then what taxes he should charge those who did own their own land. This would become the Domesday Book, a great survey carried out by officials of the Norman king, which allowed him to understand which land and resources he owned and what was owed to him by other landowners and the people. 2 volumes were produced, providing over 832 folios of information that is astonishingly comprehensive for its time. And actually, many in England still refer to this book in some ways about different areas of England. It's still actually pretty accurate in some areas. Number 18, William struggled to maintain control of England and Normandy in his later years. William would continue to face many challenges to his rule over England and Normandy, including from his own son, Robert Curthose. As he became older, and especially after the death of his wife, Matilda, William became less able to maintain control over his empire. His troubles continued when he learned that his half-brother, Odo, was secretly trying to purchase the papacy for himself. William was so upset that he personally arrested Odo and kept him in prison for the rest of his reign. William was besieging the city of Mons in the summer of 1087 when he fell from his horse. He was taken to Rouen, where his health declined, and on September 9th, he died. And we talked about this both in the video and early in the program, that he had hit very hard against the pommel of his horse due to this battle. And so it was kind of a freak accident, but he suffered mortal injuries that he ended up dying from 5 weeks later. See a picture of the event there on the bottom right. Number 19, every major church in England was rebuilt as a result of the Norman conquest. The Anglo-Saxons were not famed for building in stone. and during the first half of the 11th century had not embraced the new architectural style known as Romanesque that had become fashionable on the continent and in France. Before 1066, the only major Romanesque church in England was Edward the Confessor's new abbey at Westminster, still not quite finished at the time of the king's death on January 5th of that year. Normandy, by contrast, had experienced a church-building boom during the rule of William the Conqueror, with dozens of new abbeys founded and ancient cathedrals built. After the conquest of England, his revolution was extended, and beginning with the rebuilding of Canterbury Cathedral in 1070, England had 15 cathedrals in the 11th century. By the time William's death in 1087, 9 of them had been rebuilt, and by the time of the death of his son Henry I in 1135, so too had the remaining 6. So pretty amazing, the rebuilding of these very large structures that William and his son undertook in French and Romanesque style. Number 20, the Norman conquest also introduced castles to Britain. Castles were a French invention. The earliest examples were built around the turn of the first millennium along the Loire Valley. There were plenty in Normandy before 1066, but only a tiny handful in England, built in the previous generation by French friends of the English king, Edward the Confessor. The Norman conquest changed all of that. William and his conquerors built over 400 castles during his reign to remind the people of his power and reach. You see some of the incredible castles that still stand today, which you can see all over England. Some really great examples there of what William and his people built. Number 21, the Normans introduced chivalry to Britain. Savage in their warfare, William and the Normans were more civilized in their politics. Before 1066, the English political elite had routinely resorted to murdering their political rivals, as they would do again in the later Middle Ages. But for more than 2 centuries after the conquest, chivalry prevailed and political killing became taboo. No man dared slay another, no matter what wrong he had done to him, said the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in its summary of the plus points of William's reign. Baldorf of Northumbria, beheaded in 1067, was the only earl to be executed after the Norman takeover. The next execution of an earl in England occurred in 1306, some 230 years later. So kind of an interesting fact that William actually brought an age of chivalry to England with his conquest. See a couple great pictures of William, both on the throne and on his horse, on a couple of coins at the time. Back in that time, they actually were putting out really nice coins, very nice designs. And you see an excellent picture there of William and his shield that he would carry into battle. Number 22, William banned the English slave trade. In pre-conquest England, at least 10% of the population, and perhaps as much as 30%, were slaves. Slaves were treated as human chattel and would be sold, beaten, and branded as their masters saw fit. It was a sin to kill a slave, but not a crime. The Norman conquest hastened the demise of this system. William banned the slave trade and in some cases freed slaves all over the country, to the extent that by the end of his reign, their number had fallen by 75%. By the early 12th century, slavery in England was no more. After England had begun to have Norman lords, wrote Lawrence of Durham in the 1130s, the English no longer suffered from outsiders that which they had suffered at their own hands. In this respect, they found foreigners treated them better than they had themselves. It's really interesting, some of the changes he was bringing to British culture, banning the slave trade, changing the language, changing the money, bringing in castles and rebuilding basilicas and cathedrals. So many changes that were happening because of William and his conquerors. Number 23, the Bayeux Tapestry, which you saw there at the end of the video, was an incredible thing that was put together. It's actually the story of conquest. The Bayeux Tapestry is a masterpiece of 11th century Romanesque art, which was commissioned by Bishop Odo, William the Conqueror's half-brother, to embellish his newly built cathedral in Bayeux in 1077. The tapestry tells the story of the events surrounding the conquest of England in the Battle of Hastings by the Duke of Normandy, William. The story told by the Bayeux Tapestry begins in 1064, when Edward the Confessor, King of England, instructs his brother-in-law, Harold Godwinson, to travel to Normandy in order to offer his cousin William the succession to the English throne. The story ends with the Anglo-Saxons fleeing at the end of the Battle of Hastings in October 1066. The Bayeux Tapestry is located at the Musée de la Tapisserie de Bayeux in Bayeux, Normandy, France. And this is a must-see. If you go to Normandy, make sure you go to the Bayeux Tapestry Museum and check it out. It really is an astounding thing. It just goes forever in this museum. Number 24, William spent more time in Normandy than in England after conquest, and we mentioned this a little bit in the video. Even though he was the King of England, it is estimated he spent more than half his time in the 21 years of his reign in his home of Normandy. He would regularly go back and forth across the English Channel on his custom ship, sometimes once or twice a month, so he could rule in both places. There also were times in his rule where he was gone for multiple years from England. When he was not in England, he had a very strong hands of the king he trusted to run things in his absence. It was also believed that he very much liked sailing the open seas. On his travels back and forth, he would bring his wife and 10 kids, his loyal guard, and his favorite horse. So you can imagine what these trips were like when he would go back and forth from England back to Normandy, his home, and then back to England. Must have been quite a ship packed with his family and his horses and his loyal guard. Really interesting stuff. Number 25, celebrating with fire and the Tower of London. After William was crowned, some guards mistakenly took the raucous cheer of the crowds for insurrection rather than celebration. The guards then decided to create a diversion to rout the mistaken rebels by setting several buildings on fire. The event started a panic and very nearly stopped the crowning altogether. One of William's most visible legacies is the Tower of London. The inner keep, also known as the White Tower, was constructed just outside the boundaries of the city of London and intentionally built to be higher than any surrounding building. The goal was not only to keep control over the city, but to effectively remind the residents that he was in charge. You see a great artist rendering there of him during the crowning, actually receiving his kingdom. And then on the right there, the amazing picture there of the Tower of London that he built right on the edge of London. So William the Conqueror, as I mentioned, is in my family tree. And you can see the incredible path that he is related to us there. We have the Holy Roman Emperor on the very left side there, all the way up to the King of England and his son Henry. What is amazing is if you see there the 32, 31, 28, and 30 there with his son, Henry I, that means that my family is related to Henry I in 4 different ways. We have 4 paths to Henry I. And of course, Henry I was William the Conqueror's son. So pretty amazing that so many people are related to him, so many millions of people, and that my family is actually related to him in 4 different ways. And you can see on the very top right there in the circle is Rollo, who we mentioned earlier. He was the Viking who came over from Scandinavia and conquered Normandy. And the King of France was so scared of him that he gave Normandy to him as essentially a payoff so that he would go away and be peaceful. But this is the family tree around William that I'm directly related to. So hopefully you enjoyed that, a little bit about William, the 25 interesting facts, the great video about him and his background, his early years, his conquest of England, the subduing of England over 20 years after that, the trying to maintain his hold on both England and Normandy at the same time, which was quite a challenge, and then some of the other history and impact that's happened since his incredible conquest and reign of England and the way that he changed the culture in so many ways that we're still feeling today. So again, hope you learned a lot there and that you'll want to dig into William the Conqueror a little bit more and learn more about this history and this important impact that he had in our society. And it really is fascinating. You could spend many, many weeks just learning about William and all the different things he had to do to bring Normandy under control and then eventually England under his power, and all the different cultural aspects that created down the line. So again, hopefully you enjoyed that. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We've got great content coming your way, a lot of great programs, some really cool guests that are coming up in future episodes. And please drop us a comment down below and Tell us what you thought of the episode, and tell us maybe a topic you want us to cover in the future on traveling through history. To see you in a future episode very soon, and hope you love history as much as we do. Have a great evening.